Hello, and for a start, I want to thank the Inter-American Confederation of Catholic Schools, the Edelvives Foundation, and the Botin Foundation for making this important meeting on the future of education possible. These are still difficult times for education. All our eyes are focused still on the pandemic. But one thing is clear, the future will always surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence pushes us to think much harder about what makes us human. The kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate. We know how to educate second-class robots. People are very good to repeat what we told them. But once again, what makes us human in this time of artificial intelligence? And then there are lots of other trends shaping the future of education. We regularly study them at the OECD. Now, if you ask school leaders, on average across OECD countries, most school leaders say, yeah, climate change and global warming, that's part of our school curriculum, and also gender equality, international conflicts, causes of poverty. School leaders have that impression that our schools actually are very responsive to the global challenges of our time. But when you look at this through the lens of students, the picture is different. Yeah, most students say the climate agenda is really important. Looking after the global environment is important to me. This matters to people personally. But when you ask them, can you do something about it? Or do you think what you do makes a difference to people in other places? The bars get much shorter. And that is really the fundamental challenge of education in our times. We make learners often passive consumers of prefabricated content. But we don't provide them with the tools to mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional resources. That agency, the capacity to do things, that co-agency, the understanding that we always, do things in interaction with other people, and the collective agency, doing things together in a way that the whole becomes bigger than the sum of its parts. In the times in which we live, learning is less about teaching students something and more about providing them with a reliable compass and the tools to navigate with confidence through this increasingly volatile and ambiguous world. Of course, knowledge is always going to be at the center of this. But success is less about, disciplinary content knowledge and more about ways of thinking, ways of working. It's not just about what you know in physics and chemistry, but can you think like a scientist? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Can you design an experiment? History is not, primarily about names and places. It's about understanding, how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes. Can you think like an historian? Can you think like a philosopher? Can you think like a mathematician? And we do too little of that. We spend too little time to help young people understand the foundations of the disciplines rather than their surface. Teaching fewer things at greater depths is one of the hardest things, but some of the most important things in this post-COVID world. And your knowledge is just a start. What is very clear is that the modern world no longer rewards you just for what you know. No. Google knows everything. The modern world rewards you for what you can do with what you know, and that's the skill dimension. When you think about skills, you think first about cognitive skills, creativity, critical thinking. But equally important are the social and emotional skills that allow us to, live with ourselves, to live with people who are different from us, to live with the planet. If you ask me, what are the most transformative competencies? Well, studying this at the OECD has taught us three things. The first is about, very human capacity to create new value, to imagine, to build, to create intrinsic new worth. The second is about our capacity to navigate ambiguity. The world is no longer black and white. We often need to manage and reconcile tensions and dilemmas. And third, taking responsibility, taking action, mobilizing our cognitive, social, and emotional resources. In our last PISA assessment, we looked at one aspect of this, which we, refer to as the growth mindset of students. This idea that, if you try hard, you can trust the people around you to help you, you will be successful. You can, grow beyond yourself. And you can see actually that is here on the horizontal axis. You can see that at the system level, it correlates quite well with the overall performance of education systems on the PISA test. You look at a country like Estonia, where students have that growth mindset, that ownership over their future. And they also, perform really well on the PISA test. You contrast this with Indonesia, where students struggle with mathematics and science, and many of them believe that success is all about the intelligence they were born with. And then, why would you study hard? So the future is not just about the academic outcomes. It's very much also about that mindset with which we approach the world. And that mindset is not just, important for PISA scores or academic outcomes. You can see that actually students with the growth mindset, on the next slide, you can see they're more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. And think how important that is. If you want young people to be imaginative, creative, you have to give them space to experiment. If they experiment, they take risk. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If you do not tolerate mistakes, do not help students learn from and with mistakes, maybe your students will not be so creative. So what will the future bring? Some people say, after this pandemic, everything is going to be different. And there is that possibility for us, not just to build back better, but to build forward differently. But, education is an inherently conservative social enterprise. There is a risk that we slip back into what we knew how to do best in the past. That we educate young people for our past, not for their future. The status quo has many protectors in education. But if we do not have those education systems evolve, maybe another scenario is that actually these education systems will crack apart under the pressure of our times. Education, will move out to be run by people, parents. Society will turn to other solutions. And the pandemic has taught us, in the digital world, learning is not a place, it's an activity. And for young people, the digital world has become the real world. 15-year-olds in some countries spend 30, 40, sometimes, close to 50 hours on the internet every week. The digital world has become the real world. But being born in the digital world doesn't mean that you're a digital native. Actually, when you look at this across countries, there are just a few countries on the left, Singapore, Korea, parts of China, where you can say, well, a good majority of students, has the tools to navigate the digital world. They can distinguish fact from opinion. They can, integrate different information sources, and so on. In the majority of countries, you can see virtually everywhere in Latin America, students are not equipped for the digital world. Yes, they can operate their mobile phone and their tablet, but that's the easy part. They cannot actually, actively use the tools which they have. And those tools have become very powerful tools for learning itself, in the classroom and also in our education systems. During the pandemic, we have seen how education how technology can contribute to personalized learning, making learning more granular, more, adaptive, more interactive. And in the classroom, you can see how teachers can use technology to better understand how different students learn differently and engage with that diversity in more productive ways. These are the possibility. You can sort of use classrooms as digital systems where you read form the students and produce better information for teachers. Teachers that the information that helps teachers better to monitor and intervene, to use and share information, to build teams, to also understand more about themselves. The most controversial topic is, will robots one day enter our classrooms? It was a very abstract debate, some years ago, but during the pandemic, we've seen some examples. Robot tutors. The only way you do not learn a foreign language is by having a teacher talk to you about grammar and vocabulary. Language you always learn through interaction, and suddenly we have those robots that facilitate this. Now our students talk with robots and actually, have been quite effective. We've also seen, robots as tutors, not peer tutors. Sometimes explaining things to someone else is more effective than having someone else teaching you. And once again, technology is quite good at this. We also see very important leaps in evaluation and assessment. I believe one of the biggest mistakes that we have made in education about 300 years ago is to divorce learning and assessment. We ask students to pile up lots and lots and lots of knowledge, and then one day we call them back and say, tell me everything that you learned over the last years in 2 hours, in a very contrived, constrained setting. And that has made education very artificial, constrained teachers. Well, technology allows us to reunite learning and assessment. That's such an amazing opportunity. Well, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. When you actually look at the reality, in most countries, technology intensity in classroom relates negatively to learning outcomes. It doesn't necessarily speak against technology. It's probably more about our capacity to use it more to conserve existing practice rather than to really transform it. We have to work harder on this. If you think about, the future, what we need to do, we need to put pedagogy at the center. Make the technology less visible but present. Increase it, with pedagogical approaches. Make sure that there is, good compatibility, good interoperability. Paying more attention to learner activity than less and less to the technology as such. Making sure that we adopt a more holistic approach to smart systems and create smart systems for all that have equity, at their core, not bolted on. That's the real promise of technology. So that's one scenario. The technology will become much more present in our education systems. But it's not the only future. One of the dangers that we often face is that we, just think about one future, the future that we think was most likely. But, in the future, we have to become more agile, more open to different versions of the future. And the more different futures we can see, the better we will be prepared for the future that eventually arrives. Maybe it's not all about technology. Maybe, one day we realize that learning is not a, transactional business. It's always a social, a relational experience. Maybe schools will become, learning hubs that become the center of our communities, our societies. Traditionally, schools are very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. Maybe that will change. Schools will become true learning hubs. In our latest survey of social emotional skills, we surveyed students about their psychological well-being. If you ask 10-year-olds, it looks really good. You can see most 10-year-olds say, my daily life is filled with things that really interest me, or I feel cheerful and in good spirits. When you ask 15-year-olds, the bars get a lot shorter, particularly for girls. We need to be aware of that. Student well-being is not just, a nice to have. It's a very important outcome that we need to respect, take into account, make visible in education. Now you ask yourself, what's at the heart of that well-being? Well, the best predictors of student well-being that we found in all of the cities that we had data for, and you can see, for example, in the Americas, you can see Manizales and also Bogota having data, but in all other cities as well. What predicts student well-being? It's not anxiety with tests or pressure from parents and teachers. Actually what we saw is that High expectations from parents and teachers are positive. They actually support the well-being of students. But what is important is the stress resistance of students, their optimism, their energy, and particularly optimism. You see the pink bars here, the longest now. How can we make students more optimistic, more energetic, more stress resistant? And the answer to this question is actually quite simple. What we found is that the best predictor for stress resistance, optimism, emotional control was the quality of the student-teacher relationship. Not what you taught, not, the curriculum, but the perceived quality of the student relationship in the eyes of learners. And by the way, the quality of the relationship was also a very powerful predictor for students' sense of responsibility, their persistence, their self-control, their inner empathy, their trust, their cooperation, their tolerance, their creativity, their curiosity, and so on. So maybe that scenario is not so, abstract. Maybe, we should pay more attention to this now. Make learning less, a routine where you just absorb content. Give teachers more time to sort of understand who their students are and who they want to become, and how they can accompany them on their journey, rather than just thinking, I need to teach these pages off the textbook. And the other part of the equation is, how can we empower schools themselves to take on more responsibility? If you look to countries in South America, and actually I would say in the Spanish-speaking world in general, you can see schools generally have very little responsibility. Most of the decisions are made, by the central government or the regional government. Maybe that's something to revisit. What you can see in some of the highest performing countries, schools are, the engineers of their success. They have a lot of professional autonomy. They always work in a collaborative culture. Well, I talked about 3 scenarios. We could build an endless range of scenarios here, but we don't have that time. But it's not the point how many they are and what they are. The point is, again, that we are starting to think more about alternative futures, different versions of the future, and then ask ourselves, what implications do they have for the goals and functioning of education systems, for the organization of structures, for the teaching workforce, for governance and geopolitics, and of course, for public authorities. And then we always keep in mind, there will always be important tensions and dilemmas. Think about it, How do we reconcile the urgent with the important? How do we, modernize and disrupt all at the same time? The gradual improvement and the disruptive change. How do we reconcile new goals with old structures? How do we educate globally oriented young people who still remain rooted in their local traditions and cultures? People who lose that floor under their feet are going to be building walls around them. We need to help young people find their identity and still be open to the world, to other ways of thinking, other ways of walking, other types of people. How do we encourage innovation in this inherently conservative social enterprise education? How do we leverage potential and still, bring this to bear with the current institutional structures, the current reality? How do we reconcile the virtual possibilities with the importance of the relational, the face-to-face experiences? Well, I know you're going to find good answers to this at this conference. My best wishes for this, and thank you again. Gracias.